The morning mist hung low over the palace grounds as Margaret Thornfield adjusted her visitor's badge for the third time. She had been waiting in the ornate reception hall for nearly 20 minutes, her appointment scheduled precisely for 9 a.m. As a renowned historian specializing in British royal archives, she had been granted rare access to examine centuries-old documents housed in the palace's private collection. This opportunity represented the culmination of 5 years of research proposals and bureaucratic navigation. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and Margaret found herself studying the intricate patterns in the ceiling while she waited. Her leather satchel contained carefully prepared materials: white cotton gloves, acid-free folders, and a detailed list of manuscripts she hoped to examine. The palace staff had been thorough in their instructions: no unauthorized photographs, no unsupervised access to materials, and absolutely no deviation from the approved research areas. At 9:18 a.m., a young palace aide named Thomas approached with an apologetic smile. He explained that the archivist had been delayed due to an unexpected security briefing, but assured Margaret that someone would escort her shortly. The delay seemed routine enough, though Margaret noticed an unusual tension in the air. Staff members moved more briskly than usual, their conversations conducted in hushed tones. Finally, at 9:35 a.m., Senior Archivist Edmund Walsh appeared, slightly out of breath and carrying a thick folder of protocols. He greeted Margaret warmly, though she detected a hint of distraction in his manner. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the archive wing, Edmund explained the day's procedures with meticulous detail, emphasizing the importance of following every security measure. The archive wing itself was a marvel of preservation technology. Climate-controlled chambers housed documents dating back to the medieval period, each item cataloged with scientific precision. Margaret felt a familiar thrill as she entered the research room, where several boxes of requested materials had been prepared for her examination. The room was spartanly furnished with a single research table, proper lighting, and monitoring equipment that recorded all activity. Edmund positioned himself at a nearby desk, ready to assist with any questions while maintaining the required supervision. Margaret began her work methodically, photographing each document with the approved equipment and making careful notes in her research journal. The manuscripts were extraordinary: personal correspondence from the 18th century, administrative records that shed new light on historical events, and diplomatic documents that had never been publicly examined. As the morning progressed, Margaret became increasingly absorbed in her research. She discovered correspondence that contradicted several established historical narratives, particularly regarding trade relationships with European powers. The implications for her research were significant, and she found herself taking more detailed notes than originally planned. Around 11:30 a.m., Edmund excused himself briefly to attend to other duties, leaving Margaret with strict instructions to continue only with the materials already on her table. He assured her he would return within 15 minutes. Margaret nodded absently, her attention focused on a particularly fascinating letter that discussed secret negotiations between British and French diplomats. The research room fell into peaceful silence, broken only by the soft whir of climate control systems and Margaret's careful page-turning. She was entirely engrossed in transcribing a crucial passage when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Assuming it was Edmund returning, she continued her work without looking up. The footsteps stopped directly outside the research room door, followed by what sounded like a brief, muffled conversation. Margaret glanced toward the door but saw nothing unusual through the frosted glass panels. She returned her attention to the manuscript, but found herself slightly distracted by the continuing sounds of movement in the hallway. Several more minutes passed before Margaret realized that the sounds outside had changed in character. Instead of the measured footsteps of staff members going about their duties, she heard what seemed to be multiple people speaking in urgent, though still quiet, tones. The conversation appeared to be growing more intense, though she couldn't make out specific words. Concerned that something might be wrong, Margaret set down her pen and listened more carefully. The voices were definitely becoming more animated, and she began to distinguish at least 3 different speakers. One voice, deeper than the others, seemed to be asking questions, while 2 higher-pitched voices responded with what sounded like explanations or justifications. Margaret found herself in an awkward position. She had been explicitly instructed to remain in the research room and continue working only with approved materials. However, the conversation outside was becoming loud enough to be distracting, and she was beginning to worry that some kind of problem had developed that might affect her access to the archives. She decided to approach the door quietly and listen more carefully, hoping to determine whether the situation required any response on her part. As she moved closer to the door, the voices became more distinct. Though still muffled by the heavy wood and soundproofing materials used throughout the archive wing, the deeper voice was clearly in a position of authority, asking pointed questions about procedures and protocols. The two other voices, which Margaret now realized belonged to security personnel based on their formal tone and specific terminology, were providing detailed explanations about visitor management and access controls. As Margaret stood near the door, trying to decide whether to return to her research or somehow signal that she was present in the room, the conversation outside took on a more serious tone. The authoritative voice began speaking more firmly, using words like unacceptable and immediate review. The security personnel's responses became more defensive, though still respectful. Margaret realized that whatever was happening outside directly concerned the archive wing and possibly visitor access procedures. She wondered if the incident might affect her research schedule or her ability to return for future visits. The thought troubled her, as this opportunity was crucial for completing her book manuscript. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with the tone remaining serious but professional. Margaret could hear papers being shuffled and what sounded like someone taking notes or referring to written materials. The discussion seemed to focus on specific procedures and whether they had been properly followed. Eventually, the voices began to fade as the group apparently moved further down the corridor. Margaret remained by the door for a few more moments, listening to ensure that the situation had passed, before returning to her research table. She tried to refocus on the historical documents but found herself distracted by curiosity about what had transpired. When Edmund finally returned to the research room, approximately 10 minutes later than he had originally indicated, Margaret noticed that he appeared somewhat flustered. His usually neat appearance was slightly disheveled, and he carried several additional folders that hadn't been present when he left. He apologized for the extended absence, explaining vaguely that he had needed to address some procedural questions. Margaret decided not to mention the conversation she had overheard, assuming that if it were relevant to her work, Edmund would inform her directly. Instead, she asked a few technical questions about the manuscripts she was examining, and Edmund responded with his usual expertise and helpfulness, though she sensed he remained somewhat preoccupied. The remainder of the morning session proceeded normally, with Margaret making significant progress on her research objectives. The documents proved even more valuable than she had anticipated, containing information that would substantially enhance her understanding of the historical period she was studying. She felt grateful for the opportunity and hoped that whatever minor administrative issue had occurred earlier would not affect future access. As noon approached and the scheduled end of her morning session drew near, Margaret began organizing her notes and preparing to return the manuscripts to Edmund's care. She had filled nearly 20 pages in her research journal and had identified several additional documents she hoped to examine during her afternoon session. Edmund helped her properly store the materials and reminded her of the procedures for the afternoon session, which was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. after the lunch break. He mentioned that she would be working with a different set of documents in the afternoon, focusing on diplomatic correspondence from a slightly later historical period. Margaret left the archive wing feeling satisfied with her progress, but still curious about the incident she had witnessed. As she walked back through the palace corridors toward the visitor exit, she noticed that security personnel seemed more visible than they had been during her arrival. Guards were stationed at several locations where she hadn't seen them earlier, and their demeanor appeared more alert than usual. In the main reception area, Margaret encountered the same young aide, Thomas, who had assisted her earlier in the morning. He inquired politely about her research session and confirmed the arrangements for her afternoon return. Margaret mentioned casually that she had noticed increased security presence, and Thomas responded with a diplomatic explanation about routine security reviews that occasionally required additional personnel deployment. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, though Margaret sensed there was more to the situation than Thomas was revealing. She decided not to pursue the matter further, recognizing that palace security arrangements were not her area of expertise or concern. Her primary focus remained on maximizing the value of her research opportunity. As Margaret exited the palace grounds for her lunch break, she reflected on the morning's work and planned her approach for the afternoon session. The historical documents had exceeded her expectations, and she felt confident that her research would contribute significantly to historical scholarship. Whatever administrative or security matter had created the earlier commotion seemed to have been resolved without affecting her access or work environment. The palace grounds were bustling with the usual mixture of staff members, visitors, and security personnel going about their various duties. Margaret appreciated the careful balance between maintaining historical preservation and allowing scholarly access, recognizing the complex logistics involved in managing such an important cultural institution. She looked forward to returning for the afternoon session, eager to examine the diplomatic correspondence that Edmund had mentioned. The morning's discoveries had already provided enough material for several chapters of her book, and she hoped the afternoon would prove equally productive. The incident she had overheard seemed increasingly remote and irrelevant to her primary purpose, though she remained mildly curious about its resolution. Margaret returned to the palace at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes before her scheduled afternoon session. The security checkpoint seemed more thorough than it had been in the morning, with guards examining visitor credentials more carefully and conducting additional bag inspections. Margaret attributed this to the routine security review that Thomas had mentioned earlier, though she noticed several visitors ahead of her expressing mild frustration at the increased scrutiny. When she finally cleared security and entered the main reception area, Margaret observed that the atmosphere had shifted noticeably since her morning departure. Staff members moved with greater urgency, and she overheard fragments of conversations that suggested some kind of ongoing situation requiring management attention. Several senior staff members were engaged in what appeared to be serious discussions, consulting clipboards and speaking in the measured tones typically reserved for crisis management. Thomas approached Margaret as she waited to be escorted back to the archive wing, but his usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a more formal, professional manner. He explained that there would be a brief delay in beginning her afternoon session due to ongoing security protocols, but assured her that the delay would not significantly impact her research time. Margaret sensed that Thomas was being carefully diplomatic in his explanation, avoiding specific details about the nature of the security concerns. While waiting in the reception area, Margaret noticed several individuals she hadn't seen during her morning visit. These appeared to be senior palace officials, distinguished by their formal attire and the deferential manner with which other staff members approached them. They were engaged in quiet but intense discussions, occasionally referencing documents and making notes in official-looking folders. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Edmund appeared to escort Margaret back to the archive wing, but his demeanor had changed markedly since their morning session. Where he had previously been relaxed and conversational, he now seemed tense and preoccupied. His explanations of afternoon procedures were more abbreviated than usual, and he kept glancing at his watch as though concerned about timing. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the archive wing, Margaret noticed increased security presence throughout the building. Additional guards were stationed at various points, and she observed several security personnel conducting what appeared to be routine patrols in areas where she hadn't seen such activity earlier. The overall atmosphere suggested heightened alertness without any sense of immediate danger. Upon reaching the research room, Margaret found that her afternoon materials had been prepared with the same meticulous care as the morning documents. However, she noticed that Edmund positioned himself more centrally in the room than he had earlier, maintaining a clearer line of sight to both Margaret's work area and the door. His supervision seemed more attentive, though still professional and unobtrusive. Margaret began examining the afternoon's collection of diplomatic correspondence, finding them as fascinating as the morning's materials. These documents revealed previously unknown details about international negotiations and treaty discussions from the late 18th century. However, she found her concentration periodically disrupted by sounds from the corridor outside, which seemed busier than it had been during the morning session. Around 2:45 p.m., Margaret was deep in examining a particularly complex treaty negotiation when she heard distinct footsteps approaching the research room. Unlike the casual foot traffic she had noticed earlier, these steps were measured and purposeful, suggesting someone of importance approaching with specific intent. Edmund immediately looked up from his work, his expression becoming more alert. The footsteps stopped directly outside the research room door, followed by a soft but authoritative knock. Edmund rose quickly and moved to the door, opening it to reveal a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. Margaret recognized him immediately from news photographs as William, one of the senior members of the royal family, known for his hands-on approach to palace management and his reputation for addressing problems directly. William's presence immediately transformed the atmosphere in the research room. His bearing commanded respect without being intimidating, and his manner suggested someone accustomed to dealing with complex situations requiring both diplomacy and firm decision-making. He greeted Edmund courteously, but with an undertone that indicated serious business needed to be addressed. Edmund stepped into the corridor to speak with William privately, leaving Margaret alone in the research room. Through the partially open door, she could hear their conversation, though she tried to maintain focus on her research out of respect for their privacy. However, the serious tone of their discussion made it difficult to ignore completely. William's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but his manner remained professional and controlled. He was asking specific questions about security protocols and visitor management procedures, particularly focusing on the morning's events. Edmund's responses were detailed and defensive, suggesting he was being asked to account for decisions or actions that had been called into question. As their conversation continued, Margaret began to understand that the morning's incident had been more significant than she had initially realized. William was conducting what appeared to be a thorough review of how the situation had been handled, asking pointed questions about timing, communication protocols, and adherence to established procedures. The discussion revealed that there had been a security concern involving visitor access to restricted areas, though the specific details remained unclear from Margaret's limited perspective. William's questions suggested that proper protocols had not been followed, and he was seeking to understand exactly what had gone wrong and why. Edmund's explanations became increasingly detailed as William pressed for specifics. Margaret could hear rustling papers and what sounded like someone reviewing written reports or logs. The tone remained professional throughout, but William's questions left no doubt that he expected complete accountability for any procedural failures. After approximately 10 minutes of private discussion, William and Edmund returned to the research room. William's demeanor immediately became warmer and more personable as he was introduced to Margaret. He apologized sincerely for any disruption to her research and assured her that palace security reviews were routine matters that should not affect her work environment. However, Margaret sensed that William was using this opportunity to observe the archive wing operations firsthand. His questions about her research were genuinely interested, but she noticed him also assessing the physical setup of the room, the positioning of monitoring equipment, and the sightlines available to supervising staff members. William spent several minutes discussing Margaret's historical research with evident knowledge and enthusiasm. His questions demonstrated familiarity with the time period she was studying and genuine appreciation for the scholarly value of her work. However, Margaret detected that part of his attention remained focused on evaluating the operational aspects of the archive wing. During their conversation, William casually inquired about Margaret's experience with palace security procedures, and whether she had encountered any unusual situations or delays. His questions were phrased diplomatically, but Margaret recognized them as part of his investigation into the morning's events. She provided honest but general responses, avoiding specific details about the conversation she had overheard. After spending approximately 15 minutes in the research room, William prepared to continue his review of palace operations. Before leaving, he assured Margaret that any necessary security adjustments would be implemented without disrupting legitimate research activities. His manner suggested someone who took both security concerns and scholarly access seriously, seeking solutions that would address problems without creating unnecessary obstacles. As William departed, Edmund remained in the research room but appeared significantly more tense than before. He busied himself with organizing files and checking monitoring equipment, actions that seemed designed to demonstrate proper attention to protocols. Margaret sensed that Edmund felt his professional competence was being evaluated and that William's visit had increased pressure on all archive wing staff. The remainder of the afternoon session proceeded with Edmund maintaining heightened vigilance over all procedures. He was more attentive to Margaret's handling of documents, more frequent in his checks of monitoring equipment, and more careful in his documentation of the session's activities. While his increased attention didn't interfere with Margaret's work, It created an atmosphere of formal supervision that hadn't existed during the morning. Margaret continued making excellent progress with the diplomatic correspondence, discovering several documents that would significantly enhance her research. However, she found herself occasionally distracted by ongoing activity in the corridor outside. The sounds suggested continued security reviews and staff meetings related to the morning's incident. Around 4 p.m., Margaret heard another set of purposeful footsteps approaching the research room, followed by voices she recognized as belonging to senior palace staff members. The conversation outside was brief but appeared to involve receiving updates or reports related to the ongoing security review. Edmund listened intently to these exchanges, though he remained at his supervisory post in the research room. As her scheduled session neared its end, Margaret began organizing her research materials and preparing her notes for departure. The afternoon had been highly productive despite the various distractions, and she felt satisfied with the progress she had made on both sets of historical documents. However, she remained curious about the full scope of the security incident that had prompted such thorough review procedures. Edmund helped Margaret properly store the afternoon's materials and reminded her of procedures for any future visits. His manner had returned somewhat to its morning friendliness, though she sensed continued underlying tension related to the day's events. He assured her that any necessary security adjustments would not affect scholarly access to the archives. As Margaret prepared to leave the archive wing, she reflected on the day's unusual combination of exceptional research opportunities and behind-the-scenes administrative drama. The historical documents had provided invaluable insights for her work, while the security incident had offered an unexpected glimpse into the complex operational requirements of managing such an important cultural institution. Walking back through the palace corridors toward the visitor exit, Margaret observed that the heightened security presence remained visible throughout the building. Staff members continued to move with increased purposefulness, and she noticed several areas where additional guards had been stationed. The overall atmosphere suggested ongoing review and adjustment of security protocols. In the main reception area, Margaret encountered Thomas once more as she prepared to complete her departure procedures. His manner had returned to its usual friendliness, though he inquired more specifically about her afternoon experience and whether any aspects of palace operations had affected her work. Margaret provided positive feedback while avoiding detailed discussion of the security-related activities she had observed. As she completed the final departure procedures and returned her visitor credentials, Margaret felt grateful for the exceptional research opportunity she had been granted. The historical documents had exceeded her expectations and would contribute significantly to her scholarly work. The day's security incidents, while creating some atmospheric tension, had not substantially interfered with her ability to conduct productive research. Leaving the palace grounds, Margaret looked forward to analyzing her extensive notes and incorporating her discoveries into her book manuscript. The experience had reinforced her appreciation for the complex balance required to maintain historical preservation while providing scholarly access. Whatever security concerns had prompted the day's heightened procedures seemed to have been addressed professionally and thoroughly, ensuring the continued protection of invaluable cultural resources. 3 days after Margaret's research visit, the full scope of the palace security incident began to emerge through internal investigation reports. William had spent those days conducting comprehensive interviews with staff members at every level, reviewing security footage, and examining operational procedures with forensic attention to detail. What had initially appeared to be a minor protocol violation had revealed systemic weaknesses in visitor management systems that demanded immediate attention. The investigation revealed that the morning incident had originated when 2 junior security guards, Stevens and Bradley, had failed to properly verify the credentials of a maintenance contractor who had claimed authorization to service climate control equipment in the archive wing. The contractor, who later proved to be legitimate but was working from outdated authorization codes, had been allowed access to sensitive areas without proper verification procedures being followed. Edmund Walsh, the senior archivist, had discovered the contractor working in a restricted area adjacent to the research room where Margaret was conducting her studies. The contractor's presence had not been communicated to archive staff, and his authorization had not been properly logged in the daily security briefings. This discovery had prompted Edmund to immediately contact security personnel and request clarification of the situation. The initial response from Stevens and Bradley had been defensive rather than investigative. Instead of immediately verifying the contractor's authorization through proper channels, they had attempted to justify their decision to grant access based on the contractor's presentation of what appeared to be legitimate credentials. This approach had delayed proper resolution of the situation and created confusion about who held responsibility for the security lapse. Williams' investigation revealed that the incident represented a breakdown in communication between multiple departments. The maintenance request had been properly authorized by facilities management, but the updated authorization codes had not been distributed to security personnel due to an administrative oversight. The contractor had been using previous codes that were no longer valid, but security guards had not been informed that the codes had been changed. Furthermore, the investigation showed that Stevens and Bradley had not followed established protocols for handling uncertain authorization situations. Rather than seeking supervisory guidance when faced with unfamiliar credentials, they had made independent decisions that bypassed important security safeguards. Their actions, while not malicious, had created potential vulnerabilities in archive security. Williams' review of security footage confirmed these findings and revealed additional procedural lapses. The guards had failed to escort the contractor throughout his work, had not properly logged his entry and exit times, and had not communicated his presence to relevant staff members. These oversights had created a situation where unauthorized personnel could potentially have accessed sensitive materials without detection. On the morning of the fourth day following Margaret's visit, William convened a formal meeting with all relevant personnel in the palace's oak-paneled conference room. Present were Stevens and Bradley, their immediate supervisor, Captain Morrison, Edmund Walsh, Facilities Manager Helen Crawford, and Security Director Colonel Richardson. The atmosphere was formal and serious, reflecting the gravity of the security concerns that had been identified. William entered the conference room with a thick folder of investigation materials and surveillance photographs. His demeanor was composed but unmistakably stern, indicating that he viewed the incident as representing serious failures in palace security operations. He took his seat at the head of the conference table and surveyed the assembled staff members with the measured gaze of someone preparing to deliver uncomfortable but necessary truths. Beginning with a comprehensive review of the timeline, William methodically outlined every aspect of the incident, from the initial authorization request through the final resolution of the security concerns. His presentation was factual and detailed, leaving no room for ambiguity about what had occurred and where procedures had failed. Each staff member's role in the incident was clearly identified, along with specific procedural violations that had contributed to the security lapse. Stevens and Bradley sat uncomfortably as William detailed their failures to follow established protocols. His tone remained professional throughout, but his words left no doubt about the seriousness of their mistakes. He emphasized that palace security procedures existed not to create unnecessary bureaucracy, but to protect invaluable cultural resources and ensure the safety of all personnel and visitors. The review revealed that Stevens, in particular, had demonstrated poor judgment in multiple aspects of the incident. When initially confronted by Edmund about the unauthorized contractor, Stevens had become defensive and had attempted to shift responsibility rather than acknowledging the procedural failure and taking corrective action. His response had escalated the situation unnecessarily and had delayed proper resolution. Bradley's role, while less central, had been equally problematic. As the senior of the two guards, he should have recognized that the authorization credentials required verification through proper channels. His failure to insist on following established procedures had enabled Stevens's poor decisions and had contributed to the overall security lapse. Williams' investigation had also revealed broader systemic issues that extended beyond the individual failures of the two guards. Communication protocols between departments needed improvement, authorization procedures required updating, and supervisory oversight needed strengthening. However, he made clear that these systemic issues did not excuse the fundamental failure to follow existing protocols. As William concluded his presentation of findings, the conference room remained silent. The assembled staff members understood that they were witnessing a thorough professional reckoning that would have lasting implications for palace security operations. William's comprehensive approach left no aspect of the incident unexamined and no responsibility unassigned. William then addressed each individual involved in the incident, beginning with Stevens and Bradley. His words were measured but firm, emphasizing that palace security was not merely a job, but a sacred trust that required unwavering attention to detail and absolute adherence to established procedures. He explained that their failures had not only created immediate security vulnerabilities, but had also undermined confidence in the overall security system. Looking directly at Stevens, William stated that the guards' defensive response to legitimate questions about security procedures was completely unacceptable. He emphasized that when palace staff members identify potential security concerns, the appropriate response is immediate investigation and verification, not defensive justification of questionable decisions. Stevens's attempt to avoid responsibility rather than address the problem had compounded the original error significantly. Bradley received similar criticism for his failure to exercise appropriate supervisory judgment. As the more experienced guard, he bore additional responsibility for ensuring that proper procedures were followed. His passive acceptance of Stevens's poor decisions had enabled the security lapse and had failed to meet the standards expected of senior security personnel. William's tone became particularly stern as he addressed both guards simultaneously. He explained that their actions had not only violated specific security protocols, but had also demonstrated attitudes that were fundamentally incompatible with palace security requirements. The defensive and responsibility-avoiding responses they had exhibited suggested a lack of understanding about the critical importance of their roles. However, William's approach was not merely punitive. He also addressed the systemic issues that had contributed to the incident, acknowledging that communication failures and procedural gaps had created conditions that made individual errors more likely. He announced immediate changes to authorization procedures, enhanced supervisory oversight, and improved interdepartmental communication protocols. Captain Morrison, the guard's immediate supervisor, was directed to implement comprehensive retraining programs for all security personnel, with particular emphasis on proper response procedures when authorization questions arise. The training would include scenario-based exercises designed to reinforce appropriate decision-making under pressure and to emphasize the importance of following established protocols without exception. Edmund Walsh received recognition for his proper handling of the situation once he discovered the unauthorized contractor. His immediate response in questioning the contractor's presence and seeking supervisory guidance had demonstrated the type of vigilance and professional responsibility that William expected from all staff members. However, William also noted that earlier communication about visitor schedules could have prevented some confusion. Facilities manager Helen Crawford was directed to overhaul authorization procedures to ensure that security personnel always received timely updates about approved contractor access. The administrative oversight that had led to outdated authorization codes being used would be prevented through redundant communication systems and regular verification procedures. Security Director Colonel Richardson received instructions to conduct comprehensive reviews of all security protocols and to implement regular testing procedures that would identify potential vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. The incident had revealed gaps in oversight that needed immediate attention across all palace security operations. As the meeting progressed toward its conclusion, William made clear his expectations for future performance. He emphasized that palace security required not just technical competence, but also professional maturity, personal accountability, and unwavering commitment to protecting cultural treasures and ensuring visitor safety. Any future incidents involving procedural failures or defensive responses to legitimate questions would result in immediate disciplinary action. William's final remarks were directed specifically at Stevens and Bradley, though his words carried implications for all palace personnel. He stated simply but emphatically, "When mistakes are made, the appropriate response is acknowledgement, correction, and learning. When palace staff identify potential problems, the appropriate response is gratitude and immediate investigation. Defensive attitudes and responsibility avoidance are completely incompatible with the trust placed in palace personnel." The two guards were placed on probationary status pending completion of comprehensive retraining programs and demonstration of improved professional attitudes. Their continued employment would depend on their ability to meet enhanced performance standards and to demonstrate the type of professional responsibility that palace security demanded. Following the formal meeting, William conducted individual conversations with Stevens and Bradley to ensure they fully understood both the seriousness of their failures and the pathway for professional redemption. He emphasized that their positions could be retained if they demonstrated genuine commitment to improvement and adherence to the highest professional standards. The incident's resolution included immediate implementation of enhanced security procedures throughout the palace. New protocols required multiple verification steps for contractor access, mandatory supervisory notification for any unusual situations, and regular testing of communication systems between departments. These changes were designed to prevent similar incidents while maintaining appropriate access for legitimate visitors and researchers. Margaret Thornfield, who had unknowingly witnessed the beginning of this significant security incident, received a personal letter from William thanking her for her patience during the security review and assuring her that palace security enhancements would not interfere with future scholarly access to historical materials. Her research opportunity had proceeded successfully, despite the behind-the-scenes administrative challenges. The palace security incident ultimately served as a catalyst for comprehensive improvements in operational procedures and staff accountability. William's thorough investigation and firm response had addressed immediate security concerns while establishing clear expectations for professional performance. The message to all palace personnel was unmistakable. Excellence in security and service required both technical competence and professional maturity, with no tolerance for defensive attitudes when legitimate concerns were raised. In the weeks that followed, the enhanced security procedures proved effective in preventing similar incidents while maintaining the palace's commitment to scholarly access and cultural preservation. The incident had revealed important vulnerabilities, but William's decisive leadership had transformed those vulnerabilities into opportunities for institutional improvement and strengthened security operations.